So first of all, I just want to say that in terms of the heart of the gospel of Jesus and living the gospel of Jesus, those of us by grace who have awakened to people in prison, it's purely a grace thing that we're involved in one of the deepest experiences of the heart of the gospel. We are a country that throws away people, that incarcerates people, that throws people into exile. We are a country that identifies people by the worst act of their life and then treats them accordingly. We are a country that by and large has disrespected our poor and thrown them and exiled them and put them in places, separating them from their families and punishing them. We are a country that who often, when you pare it down, believes in a God who is punisher in chief. That punishment is the way to change human beings, or maybe not even to change them, but to make them pay for what they have done. And so it feeds right into the politics. It feeds right into the us and them. It feeds right into they are the enemy. We punish them and we are righteous in doing so. It is part of what we call sacralized violence. This is what God desires. Even the story of Adam and Eve is quoted. They sinned, they're punished. You leave the garden and you're punished. We are the highest incarcerator in the world. My state, Louisiana, is the highest incarcerator of all the states. So how did I even come into this? I call it grace to even wake up to the fact of prisoners. Growing up as a young kid in Louisiana and going to Girl Scout camp, the Girl Scout camp, Camp Marydale, was right across the road from Route 66, that dead end into Angola prison, where people are thrown away for life. And I was unaware. I was a child of privilege, white, a father, successful lawyer, being educated in the best schools. I was separated. And I've come to understand this, that even people's belief in the death penalty or saying they believe in it is because we're separated from it, separated from the suffering, separated from what happens to human beings, that everybody's worth more than the worst thing they've ever done. Even Texas used to have this thing of future dangerousness. Look at what this person's done, and we predict that they'll continue to be dangerous. I mean, in the rhetoric around the death penalty is you hear politicians when they say, or DAs going for the death penalty, this person is such a natural killer, we can't even put him in prison for life. They'll kill other inmates or the guards. That's how evil they are. They're unredeemable. And those absolute statements being made about other people. And then even life without parole, that's another sentence, as Pope Francis has pointed out, of death in prison. So the harshness, we are into the harshness. So you couldn't have a better theme than compassion of what it is that we're about. Because what is compassion? Calm and passio, to feel with. But how are you going to feel with anybody when you're separated from them? Whoever meets people in prison. Prisons are places where nobody goes. And so that's why I say it's grace. It's grace that woke us up to venture past all those moats around the castle, to go into the place where people have been thrown away and treated as objects, as things. I heard Millard Farmer, one of the first lawyers I ever met with, trying to say people on death row are treated as disposable human waste. And when you hear the rhetoric about their lives, that we can't wait to rid this vermin, these monsters, they're worse than animals. And that's what we're dealing with. How do we get here? For me, it's, I told about this in my book, River of Fire, about awakening to justice. First, I had to awaken that the gospel of Jesus is not just simply about being charitable to the people around us, as good as that is, right? or to do charity to people, to, to food pantries and all that good stuff that we do. We need that. But it was about justice. And how can you even understand justice unless somehow we can encounter the people who are suffering from the injustice? And for me, that was a move out of the suburbs, out of where I was, into the inner city of New Orleans, where I became neighbor to African-American people who have been struggling, well, long before I got there, and just seeing the legacy straight out of slavery of what happens to African-American people in our society, with the police, with public schools where they would drop out when they were a junior and couldn't read a third grade reader, with health care, no health care, everything. And it was seeing their suffering. It was being with them and seeing their suffering. There's a saying in Latin America, what the eye does not see, the heart cannot feel. We have to see, we have to be in proximity. And that's Pope Francis. Get out of the buildings. Stop just preaching the dogma of what are the truths of the faith, but live them. Get out, go to the margins, go to where the suffering people are. And any of us in prison ministry, by the grace of God, that's what's happened with us. And we all feel inadequate, and then we come up against the prison rules and all the ways they try to block outsiders from coming in to disrupt the smooth running of the institution. Oh, we got to have extra guards on hand. No, you can't have the retreat. There's nothing but obstacles that we face to get in. And anybody who has experienced a Kairos retreat, or when we experience visiting with people in prison, when we experience being with them, we experience praying with them. And the prayer, that's the kind of the theme resonating that I looked to today that just drew me, was the Canticle of Zachary. The dawn will come from on high, and light for those who live in the shadow of death. Well, nowhere is that truer than for people sentenced to actually die, where you actually get a date of execution and are killed. But prisons are that way too. I'm astounded at the courage I meet. I'm astounded. I love in the title, it's compassion given and compassion received, because all the deep stuff that we get involved in, if it's going to be true and of God and of the Spirit, it's going to have a mutuality in it. When we ever fall into this thing of, here we go, these wonderful people, we're going into the prison, these poor wretches, we're pouring ourselves on them, kind of, aren't we wonderful? We're the good guys coming in to help these poor people. But that moment of grace, as it says in the Book of Wisdom, when the sparks, when, let's see, the light or the fire sparks among the rubble, where the sparks of grace happen, is when we can receive from what we're also giving. My man on death row, Manuel Ortiz, that I've been accompanying for 20 years, he's going on 30 years on death row. He's innocent. One more innocent one. I'm accompanied 7 people on death row. 3 of them have been innocent. That's how broken the thing is. But innocent or not, this human being, how is he not just a pool of grease on the floor of his cell after all that has happened to him? And his courage, which I receive every time I go to visit him and I drive out of that prison. And so we want to be attentive to that in our own spiritual lives. When we get this feeling of, oh, aren't we good to do this? Or I'm tired, I don't feel like going to the prison today. Or to hold on to that mutuality of grace, to be able to receive, is really important. When you read the Gospels, and when we get the radical Jesus, when we get the pure, fresh Jesus in his day, there were a million ways that people were separated from each other. The purity code, what you could eat, what you could touch, the cleansing of the cups, who could come into what part of the temple, the us and them. Anybody with disease, you must ascend to somebody in you. There were a million ways that people were separated. And meals, you don't eat meals with just anybody. You only eat meals with Jesus encountered that in 1,000 different ways, and the shaming of people and the separation. And we see him over and over again, going past those into the margins with the people, having meals, collect people from the highways and the byways for the banquet, mixing it up with the hoi polloi, being there with the people. That was Jesus. Even that Jesus could read, we know that he could because in the Gospel of Luke, where he opened up the scroll of Isaiah, there were translations into the Aramaic from some parts of the Hebrew scripture called the Targum in Aramaic. And a lot of it was from Isaiah. And some have even studied the pattern of speech in Jesus, and the images he uses very much Isaiah. So we know that Jesus could read that. And we know that in prison, other prisoners who have taught people to read, or the education programs, that if we can help people read books, they can open pages into other worlds, and it can help to make a bridge out of their isolation and that they have, and that feeling that they're nothing. They can connect with the world. They can connect with the wisdom of the ages. So the reading and being able to read is so important. And then to meditate and to pray, to learn, to sit with the words of Scripture, and to do it together in community when we go and we visit them. To take those words like from the Canticle of Zachary, of the dawn will come from on high for those of us who live in the shadow of death. We all live in the shadow of death, but nobody more aware of that than those in prison. And also the way we relate to the guards, because Louisiana is such a classic thing. Angola prison is way out in the boonies, and you meet guards there whose grandfather worked there, whose uncle worked there, whose father worked there, they have family members that have been working at the prison for years. Well, relating to them too, because they're in a system that oppresses them as well. So blessed are we. Blessed are our eyes that see what we see. Blessed are our ears that hear what we hear. And you can't do this without community. We need gathering everybody today as we're doing, so that we can blow on the coals of our souls and feed each other with the gospel of Jesus and be replenished and be renewed in what we do is important, because there's so much in our society that throws water on the hot coals, that just goes, oh, what are you doing? You're going to prison? Do you think you're really going to make a difference? Those people, do you know what they did? We have that constantly. So that sustenance within community and with the prisoners themselves, with the human beings who are incarcerated, with them themselves. And it's an ongoing process, and we can never rest on our laurels. We can never just say, oh, as you know, because life keeps unfolding. It's fresh each new day. I want to just say a little bit about what I've noticed about the role as witnesses that we play. So first of all, we who are lucky enough, privileged enough to be able to be of service to our fellow human beings in prison, that's primary. But we also get to be witnesses. In my life, as I was introduced, I've had experiences with people in prison, even with people executed, and then I'm out on the road sharing with people through story of taking people into the experiences. And through the book, I didn't know a book could be so powerful. People are quiet when you read a book. You're not debating with anybody. And I could take people in the experience, in Dead Man Walking, and you got to bring them. You got to bring them into both sides of the issue, of the horror of the murder to an innocent victim, and to feel the outrage of that, which is ethical, and then take them step by step with me, who did not know what I was doing. I was in over my head, into that execution chamber, and to look into the eyes of that person that is now being strapped down and killed, rendered defenseless and killed by the state in a protocol of death that chills you to the bone. And you got to take people there. And so how did we, and look at this now, August 2018, very significant time in the life of the Catholic Church. After 1,500 years of dialogue, the Catholic Catechism on the death penalty was changed. Dialogue from the people of God always bubbles up and precedes the changing of something on the books. The last thing that happens is that you go to the catechism, or in states, you go to that statute that said you're going to have a death penalty, and you change it. And it's that experience of the people of God on the ground. And when it comes to prisons, when it comes to the death penalty and prison reform, that's us. And if you look and just see the number of Catholics now involved in going to prison, it's a big thing now for deacons as part of their ministry, prison ministry. And I believe it is that ongoing dialogue that changes consciousness and conscience that has bubbled up in the church that led us to the point where you have Pope Francis that actually changed the catechism. For how many years? A long, long time. You could read in the catechism, the state has the right to take life, even for executions, to take life. And that emerged when you look at the history. Augustine in the 5th century was the first to explicitly depart from the nonviolence of Jesus to say the violent can be coerced with the sword. What was the history that made him say that? What's the context? The Goths, the Visigoths, the Huns were beating down the gates of Rome, and chaos with what the bearded ones, the barbarian invasions. And because they didn't have prisons, you allowed then that the state could take the life of the violent people. In order, always the spirit was to defend society. And that kept being present there in the catechism. It went for really terrible crimes the state could execute. And Pope, Pope, not Benedict, it was John Paul II came really close to abolishing that in the Gospel of Life, Evangelium Vitae. And he said the death penalty should be rare, if not non-existent. But then he allowed for this exception. And he said, but in cases of absolute necessity, the state can execute. And we know from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, once you give any government the power to make a judgment that in this case we can kill, we've lost a battle. And when the Pope said that in his encyclical, in the dialogue I got to have with him directly, I said, you gave him a loophole, Pope. I didn't say Pope, I said, Your Holiness. And sure enough, the DA of New Orleans quoted that encyclical when he said, we can't get enough death penalties in New Orleans with all the crime we got. Every one we get's an absolute necessity. I said, we need in church teaching, it's an absolute principle. Under no circumstances, no matter how terrible the crime, can we ever allow state governments to execute. So what happened? All the bubbling up of all the experiences of people like you and me going into prison, sharing that with each other in a community of faith. It finally reached the point where then you change the catechism and you read the catechism now, and it says very clearly, no matter how grievous the crime, you cannot allow the state to execute. But now, as we embark on the path of restorative justice, away from punish, 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 which is the demeaning of people, you know, we go to restoring life. That's Jesus. That's the Spirit of God in us. Restore life. Restore it. And everybody who goes to prison, over 90% of people who go to death row, you look at the story of their lives, they were violated as children. They watched violence. The violence that was heaped on them one day, they acted out on some poor innocent person, and then the state reenacts the violence on them. Restorative justice, the way of, we got to deal with poverty, we got to deal with educating people, we got to deal with all the things that make a society just. Restorative justice, you are a human being, and for us to be in touch with our own privilege. See, we can't feel virtuous. That happened to me when I moved in among African American people in the inner city in New Orleans, and I saw these kids coming in, and people 75 years old coming in to learn to read, like Miss Ruby, who wanted to know about Moses and how to read the Bible. She had worked out in the cotton fields when she was young, and she cleaned white people's houses. She's 75, and she wants to learn to read so she can figure out what happened with Moses when he went on that mountaintop and he came back and his face was shining like that. He had to put the veil over it. She wants to know about Moses. Or the kid that came in from the public school had dropped out when he was a junior. I said, let's just work on what your reading level, your math level. And he could not read a third grade reader. And it put me in touch with, oh my God. I went to St. Joseph Academy in Baton Rouge, Sisters of St. Joseph. I knew how to do public speaking when I was a junior in high school. Look what I was given. This privilege of what I was given. It's not like I deserved it. It's not like I was any better. I was simply given it. And it puts us in touch with our own privilege of all we've been given. So it's not virtue. It's just largesse that we were given. And the way I experienced it is, I owe these people. I grew up in the Jim Crow South in Baton Rouge, where I only knew African-American people as our servants. I was never with African-American people as my peers. And it was just pure justice. I owe them. They have served me all my life. I serve them. And that's not because I'm a great white savior coming in to help these poor Black people. This is justice. And it's when I was with them that I was in that porous soil where the sprouts of the gospel can grow. And one day, coming out of that adult learning center, I had someone who had a program going on and just said, hey, Sister Helen, when I think how casual it was. Hey, Sister Helen, you want to be a pen pal to somebody on death row? And I said, sure. I mean, I very readily, I thought I was only going to write letters. I didn't have any idea I'm going to end up in an execution chamber. And that's the sneaky part about Jesus we got to throw in there. When you get involved with the gospel, you never quite know exactly where it's going to take you. Write letters. Sure, I could write a letter. And that connection just with that letter, see, I wrote a man. His name was Patrick Saunier. I sent him a picture of myself. It was one human being to another. And he wrote back. I wrote, he wrote. Realized he had no one to visit him. I remember praying with the scriptures. How many times had I meditated on the Gospel of Matthew? And I knew it by heart. I was hungry, he gave me to eat. I was thirsty, he gave me a drink. Boy, oy, 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 oy. I see the words. I was in prison and you came to me. And I'm thinking, I'm writing this man, he's got nobody to visit him. I will go and see him. It was like a flowering of the heart. It's not a big dramatic thing. It was just like, I will come and see you. I was so excited. In the return mail, will you, look, I'm a Catholic, you're a nun, would you be my spiritual advisor? Fill out the form. And little did I know that 2.5 years later, when he's executed, the only one who's going to be able to be with him in those last days in the death house is going to be the spiritual advisor. It's going to be me. Who's going to be me? And we have a maxim in our community, never leap ahead of grace. Grace comes up under us as we need it. And that happened with me, with him. And it was a formative experience of my life to be in that place having known this man for 2.5 years, and to know his humanness, and to know his goodness, and to know that he was worth far more than one violent act of his life, and then to have to be there to witness his being killed. So an execution crystallizes the violence that's in prison, where you actually see he's alive and they're strapping him in. And his act of love toward me, toward the end, was, sister, you can't be there at the end because it was electrocution. He said it could scar you. You just pray God holds up my legs. Any of us want somebody to be with us at our death, and he was willing to give that up. That was an act of love for me. Just pray God holds up my legs, but sister, you can't be there and watch this. It could scar you. And that grace rising up in me, no, Pat, I don't know what it's going to do to me. Don't worry about me. But you are not going to die without a loving face to see. And every one of our prison visits, when we walk in, sometimes as tired as we are, sometimes whatever it is we are, put it all aside. It's the presence that's everything. And their presence to us. And then to prayerfully go over that visit afterwards. What is it? And how are we being called? How are we being formed? How are they teaching us? And it takes a deep patience. People with very different life experiences, or people with different various experiences of mental disturbance as well. It can't focus or jump from one thing to another, or, just the craziness that we meet within, and the deep patience and love, and knowing that listening is far more important than any words of wisdom that are going to come out of our mouths. But presence, we keep coming back. We keep showing up. And that is the way God works in us. And it's no big 4th of July celebrations and big fireworks. It's quiet. It's all very quiet. The way the gospel, the way the seed grows in the dark soil. And we're moving in the season of Advent now. What are we waiting for? What are we awake to? What are we alert to? And what we can learn from this conference and the sharing of the experiences with each other. So thank you for letting me be a part of this today. I'm very, very happy to be here. And so I think maybe we could use the rest of our time to just share with each other comments as well as questions that we can do through Father George now, who will help us moderate this.
Sure, Sister Helen. Thank you so much for that beautiful reflection. And I know for me personally, the greatest gift of my life has been the opportunity to work with the men on death row at San Quentin. And I've gotten so much, experienced so much grace there. And one person, a number of comments, I wanted to start with one. She's sort of anticipating the rest of our day because one of the things we want to highlight today in our other trainings is the need for self-care and the reality that we're working in a system of violence and trauma. And so the one person wants to know, having dedicated so much of your life to working and serving in oppressive spaces, how do you avoid burnout? What tools do you use in your life?
Interesting. I was just with 5 women last night in Denny LaBeouf's house. These are the lawyers and the women that work in Guantanamo and who work with torture victims. Every one of the people brought to Guantanamo after 9/11 were brought to black sites and were tortured. I mean, these women have books on torture and the whole thing. And self-care is a really big thing for the people working with people, and that's true of us to some extent too. So for me, every time I get on the road to go to tell the story of what has happened to wake people up, I am engaged in changing this. We have to abolish the death penalty. And so it can't be that giving into it and I'll just be there to comfort people being killed by the state. So whenever I'm doing the work, which is to help awaken the American people. That helps heal me. When I wrote the book, Dead Man Walking, it helped heal me from that experience of watching that human being who was alive and then taken in, who was killed. And we need friendship. We need community. And we need to play. Maybe being in New Orleans helps, because playing is always around the corner. They don't call us the Big Easy for nothing, but you got to have a good time. You got to relax. You got to go see a good movie, or you got to meet with friends, or fix something good for them to eat, a whole life, and read. Do good reading of good books, but community, and then just time for prayer, discernment, and what's going on in our souls is, to me, what prayer is all about, and where the call is. I mean, just the prayer this morning. I have two icons or sacred images on my wall. One is the crucifix of Jesus always with the suffering ones, and the other is Fra Angelica's Annunciation. Annunciations come, invitations come. St. Basil in the 4th century said annunciations are frequent, incarnations are rare. But what's the invitation coming? And to be able to say yes, but also, and this is big self-care, to be able to say no. We also need to say no. We can't take on too much, and because then we get overwhelmed, and that's what causes burnout. That's just a few thoughts.
That's great. Thank you, sister. A couple of comments I want to share with you. One, Amy writes, thank you, sister, for helping us to have compassion for and pray for those working in the prison system as well, especially those, as you mentioned, who live in communities where prisons are one of the few good paying jobs. And another person writes, Sister Missy writes, never leap ahead of grace. That will be on post-it note on my desk. I appreciate your reflections as I work with the men on death row here in Texas. Your books, your messages continue to inspire me to be open to the grace of this ministry. And so, again, many, many positive comments. I want to share a couple of those. One person writes here, and this is kind of what I would want to ask too, is how do you work with the victims of crime, people who have experienced in their own lives the loss of a loved one due to murder?
Well, my work brings me mostly over to the side of people that are the incarcerated ones, but I've had very telling experiences with, like, to go, and I record this in Dead Man Walking, that experience. When the first man on death row I took, I didn't know what to do with the victims' families. They were so angry and everything, and I figured I was the last person in the world they wanted to see. I was a spiritual advisor. The people, 2 men who had killed their children. And that was a mistake. I had a really good editor when I wrote Dead Man Walking. He says, now, Helen, you're kind of downplaying that you didn't reach out to the victims' families. And he looked me right in the eye and he said, well, it was cowardice, wasn't it? I go, yeah, it was. So he said, when you write your book, don't just take people on the peaks of the waves where you do it. And it was cowardice in the sense that I didn't reach out to them. Now, that's really a hard one, where you are with the person who has murdered somebody's loved one and try to reach out to them. Very tricky. There's only one case where I actually was able to meet and form friendship and pray with the person whose son had been murdered by. But I go into victims' meetings where, like, parents of murdered children. I made a point of doing that. And then we started a group for victims. I found out all they need. They have so much that they need. The death penalty doesn't help them one bit. They're told, and the average wait from getting a death sentence to execution, 17 years. They have need for counseling. Marriages fall apart. They lose their jobs. They need so much. And that's part of the transformation that we got to make in our society in restorative justice, to put those resources, instead of putting it to killing, selectively killing people, is to put it into healing for victims' families. I did one thing. We started a group called Survive for murder victims' families. And then as I move on the road and I meet people, I'm always sensitive to, whenever victims' families are in the crowd or approach me, to give them time and give them presence. So I do that in a very small way. It's totally inadequate. Anyway, I see the people.
Yeah, we have way more questions than we're going to have time to answer, but our friends at Colby House ask if you have any examples of a country or countries that we in the United States should look to as models for restorative justice or models for abolishing the death penalty.
I'll never forget being in Dublin, Ireland, and it was a women's prison. And so a group of us went, and the first thing you notice in the yard, once you came in through the gates, was all this play equipment, tricycles and things like that, and met the warden. And he said, you know what my biggest problem is in this prison is the women don't want to leave, because it was a restorative environment in every way for them. They had counselors, you know, that helped them look at the decisions they had made in their life, the bad decisions that they had job training, they had education, they had a mentor. It was all about restoration of life, and that was in Dublin, Ireland. So he said, the warden said we had to form an alumni association, you know, with the women, because they formed community together, and then also parenting and being with their children. I had never experienced that before. It was a totally different field to walk in there, from the place of punishment and that look at what you did, and that is truly who you are, you know.
Yeah. I'm happy to say at San Quentin, we've changed our name from prison to rehabilitation center, and really a lot more of an emphasis on rehabilitation and restorative justice. A couple more points. One person asked an interesting question about jury selection, and she wants to know if you have any advice for if a person is called to be on a death qualified jury, if chosen, how would it best serve?
Well, here's the thing. I heard this now from defense lawyers. Get on that jury, they say. Get on that jury. You say whatever you got to say to get on that jury, because you know. And then this is when it comes to that, whether or not you're going to decide for death or not, you don't even have to give the reason in that jury room of why you're saying, I want him to live. You do not have to give a reason. And if you want to quote your grandmother, you want to quote the Bible or whatever, and you have that freedom to say you're going to vote for life. When they going to ask you, could you consider, and that's the key thing that the lawyer said, would you be able to consider the death penalty? You could consider anything. You could consider boiling somebody in oil. You could consider anything, but get on that jury. And also then know that power and freedom you have. I mean, how many jurors afterwards talk about the pressure on them and they gave in because everybody else, and let's get out of this jury room, let's get out of here. And they give in to pressure and regret it ever after. So anyway, that's advice from one defense attorney.
Great idea. Maybe our last point here, somebody wanted to know that since Pope Francis changed the teachings, or the catechism anyway, saying that death penalty is now inadmissible, have you seen any impact in our country or around the world to that?
Well, you know, the first thing you got to do is get the teaching straight. Now, how many Catholics read the Catholic catechism before they go to bed at night? Not too many. And the way the gospel comes alive, both from the words written in the scriptures and the gospels, and from the words written in the catechism, are the witnesses to it, which is us, to translate it into. So I think the polls, if you go take one now of Catholics, you're still going to find a majority of them that say they support the death penalty. They just haven't been on the journey yet. They're not bad people. They just haven't been on the journey yet. And that's our task.
That's right. It's going to take a lot of work, but thanks for inspiring us to do that work. And this kind of brings us to the end of our time together. So, Sister Helen, thank you so much for your time and your sharing. And I know the men on death row here at San Quentin
give them my love.
You a lot. They pray for you, and
it
makes a big impact in their lives. So thank you, and thank you all for your questions. I'm sorry we don't have all day, because I know we could spend the day with Helen and having conversations.